Jeff Bridgman here of Jeff R. Bridgman American Antiques in York County, Pennsylvania. I've come here tonight to tell you a short story about an important American historical figure. Important not only in American history, but as it relates to American art and in the context of antique American flags, which are my specialty. So, many people don't realize that the Stars and Stripes was not authorized to be carried by the United States Army until the mid-19th century. That's right, not during the War of 1812, nor during the Revolutionary War. The first war it was carried in was actually the Mexican War in the latter 1840s. So artillery was first authorized in 1834, infantry in 1841, and 1862 for cavalry. That's the second year of the Civil War. So turning back the clock a little bit, go back to the Revolutionary War, it is thought that Washington probably carried it. It certainly appears in a lot of paintings of him early on, right, and illustrations throughout time. It would have been appropriate for the command, at least, if not for the General Army. So enter our important historical guy, John Trumbull. John Trumbull was born in Lebanon, Connecticut in 1746. He was actually the son of a man, Jonathan Trumbull, not to be confused with John. It was John, not Jonathan, his son. And Jonathan Trumbull became governor of the state of Connecticut in 1769 and served to 1784. That means he was in for the entirety of the American Revolution, which was 1775 to 1783. So John actually had an older brother, also named Jonathan. So with three Johns in the house, I'd imagine if their mother screamed John, somebody got a rise, somebody got up and stood at attention. At any rate, John Trumbull was very bright, and he got into Harvard at age 15. And in 1775, he enlisted as a volunteer in the Army. He was actually at the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775, June 17th, I think that was. And he sketched the positions of both the British and American troops. Not long after that, he was appointed George Washington's aide-de-camp. He was obviously well connected politically and knew Washington and was very bright. Washington was super impressed with him. And put him on his own staff. He was actually, an aide-de-camp was basically a secretary. And about a year later, he was appointed to the staff of one of the most famous generals in the Revolutionary War, Horatio Gates. So he became an adjunct general, a deputy adjunct general in Gates's own army. And sometime he became sort of disgruntled. I don't know exactly what happened, but there was some kind of argument over the date of his military commission. And so he just had enough of it, and he said, I'm done with the Army, and he resigned his appointment to the Army. And a few years went by. This was in 1777. A few years went by, and he decided to, money was running low, he better do something to make an income, and he decided to study art. So in 1780, he traveled to England, and upon an introduction by Benjamin Franklin, he met and began to study under the very famous American artist, one of the most famous of all time, Benjamin West. Benjamin West was, even though he was an American, purely self-trained, he eventually moved to England and gained the favor of the king, of King George III, and soon thereafter he actually ran the Royal Academy. Can you believe an 18th century American artist moved from here to Britain and ran the Royal Academy? He was the second person to be put in charge of the Royal Academy, and he helped found it. So while he was there, while Trumbull was in Britain, there was a British officer in America who got captured and hung, and he was about the same rank as Trumbull had been. So the Brits, absolutely went crazy, and they knew they had to do something. So they grabbed Trumbull and they threw him in jail. He was there for a period of about 6 months before he returned to the United States. Then the war ended and Trumbull went back to England, and he was with West again in 1784. And Benjamin West told him, listen, you need to focus on American historical themes. The war just ended. America just got its independence officially, and now was a time where there was focus on patriotism and all things American. So he said, you need to paint American historical figures and military scenes, and if you do, you're going to sell them. So, how does this relate to antique American flags? Well, in 1785, Trumbull started to do what West had told him and paint historical images. And he did so for the rest of his lifetime. Over this period, he painted at least 250 works. So he was very prolific. And in 3 notable ones, he illustrated George Washington at important events during the Revolutionary War with a flag in the image where the stars were arranged in a rectangular medallion like this with a star in the very center. And this became known among flag people much later on as the Trumbull pattern. Now, the first of these 3, at least in historical order during the war itself, occurred at the Battle of Princeton, which was on January 3rd, 1777. And in this work, it was illustrated the death of General Mercer at Princeton. So let's have a look at it. The next one shows a scene in Saratoga, New York, and the surrender of General Burgoyne, which took place on October 17th of 1777. Let's have a look. The final one was painted to represent a scene that took place on October 19th, 1781, and the surrender of Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown. Very important event in the war. Let's have a look at that one. Now, the death of General Mercer, the first of them, was painted sometime in the wide window between 1789 and 1830. The other 2 were painted in 1821 and 1820, respectively, and they are in the United States Capitol Rotunda. Maybe you've seen them. Very important works. So, did Washington actually carry the flag? Well, let's look at the first one again. When was it done? There's a serious problem in this picture, and we need to point it out. So, even though it's thought that Trumbull was very accurate, he was a very detailed painter, he actually didn't have sight in one of his eyes. He lost that in an accident as a youth. And it's actually thought that one of the reasons that he was so detailed was the loss of sight in this particular eye. Interesting, right? Geez, I have a friend who has lost the sight in one eye, and this person's about the most amazing designer I've ever seen in my life. So clearly, it could even add to someone's design sense and sense of detail, despite what you might think. So, anyways, let's have a look at Trumbull and see what he looked like. This is a self-portrait done in 1803, I believe. Have a look. Pretty good looking guy, right? So none of those views were painted in first person, and there, like I said, is a problem with one of them. So first of all, even though they're painted later, well, he was with Washington, right? Well, he left sometime in 1777, and at the Battle of Princeton that occurred on January 3rd of that year, yeah, he was probably there, but the Stars and Stripes didn't exist yet. The American flag came about on June 14th, 1777. That's Flag Day. And it was designed first as a flag for the United States Navy, not the Army. So would Washington be carrying it on January 3rd, 1777? More than 6 months, a few days more than 6 months before the American flag was actually created? Unlikely. But probably it was ingrained in people's minds at the time that he should have had it, and somehow it belonged in these works. Now, the next one occurred later that year, right? October 17th or something of that nature, 17th, and 1777. Was Trumbull gone yet? I'm not exactly sure. I don't know the precise date that he traveled, but it doesn't really matter that much, because let's go to the last one. Trumbull was either in jail or on his way back from England, and what really is important about this is that several paintings of the scene at Yorktown were painted by Trumbull. He painted at least 4 different versions, and lo and behold, each version has a different version of the Stars and Stripes. Let's have a look at those quick. So the first of those was painted in 1787, and it depicts some sort of circular pattern, isn't quite clear, and red, white, and blue stripes instead of just red and white. So the second one, painted in 1790, has some sort of oval pattern going on and red and white stripes. The third one, painted in 1797, has what could be a Trumbull pattern, but the star that's supposed to be in the center is offset, and it's really fuzzy. It's really hard to see. So here we have 4 different works, these 3 and the one in the Capitol Rotunda, all with different star patterns, and one with red, white, and blue stripes. Now let's have a look at this terrific flag, and I'll tell you why this is so important, and why the pattern is important in general. The pattern is important because almost no surviving 13-star flags have it. I did an exhibit at the Museum of the American Revolution a couple of years ago where I displayed 40 13-star flags and 32 different star patterns. Of those flags that I took there, I took 2 in the Trumbull pattern. Why? Because the pattern is so early, we know, and significant, and is hardly on any surviving examples. This is just a beautiful thing. Let me bring you in for a closer look. So, 13-star flags have been made throughout American history, from the very beginning to the present. This one is a very unusual one, not only because of its star pattern, but because of its construction. Made entirely of silk. The stars are stitched on with almost an embroidery stitch, going back and forth over the edges in a way that you'll see on some Victorian pieces in the late 19th century, usually with a decorative stitch, not like this. But this is a very unusual way to attach the stars on an American flag at any time period. That is done by hand, but the stripes are done by machine. And you have to look very closely, and you can see this is actually the tiniest treadle machine stitching that I've ever seen on a flag. I have to wonder, because the flag certainly has the feel of it, if it doesn't date probably to the 1850s, which would make it very unusual to have machine sewing in that period. But Singer mass marketed the sewing machine in 1855, and it went into households immediately. But there were many competitors soon thereafter, and that is as small of machine stitching as I've ever seen on anything. I've seen a lot of small machine stitching. It tends to be small in the 19th century, but never anything like that. The white fabric is definitely weighted, meaning there were agents added to it to make it heavier. Silk merchants did this to get more money for the same amount of silk. You start to see this really in the Civil War period and then through the late 19th century. Supposedly they were weighting silks starting around the 1830s, but in my experience in early flags, you really don't see that until the Civil War or right thereabouts. And it gets pretty prevalent afterwards. Now the red is not weighted, and neither is the blue, which is this really unusual cornflower color. Unusual star patterns like this are typically seen pre-war. So my inclination is this might be an 1860 flag or just beforehand. It could be Civil War period. At the outset, I suppose it could be centennial, but it does not in any way, shape, or form have a centennial feel to me, and you really don't see this. You don't expect to see this star pattern that late. It has an open sleeve through which a rod would be passed directly and then tacked into place. Obviously, there's been some breakdown along that, but what a wonderful look this particular flag has. And I use this terrific 1820s, 30s gold gilt frame on it, big, wide, beautiful gold gilt molding that has some of the same kind of surface that the flag does. There are only about 10 known examples in the Trumbull pattern across the 19th century. I've owned either 4 or 5 of them. So this is one of the rarest patterns that you can encounter, and just a beautiful mid-19th century example with great color, and even better in person for sure than it is in these videos. So thanks for joining me today to learn about the Trumbull pattern, and hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon.